Hello, hello. Welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. I am one of the co-hosts, Drew, accompanied by my friend and co-host, Alex. Hello, Alex.
Hey, what's up, Drew? How's your week going?
It's going well. It's going well. Still quarantined, but that has not changed in the past 25 episodes we've recorded. So today's episode, we want to talk a little bit about an interesting geopolitical theory. The idea kind of originated, and I'll get into what it's called in a second. But the idea originated out of ancient Greece, believe it or not. The rising Athens was making the dominant Sparta a fearful city. And the philosopher and historian Thucydides talked about the reason the Peloponnesian War broke out in his book, The History of the Peloponnesian War. The reason was because Athens was a rising power and Sparta was fearful of Athens' rise. This has led, a simple concept, right? A simple concept. A rising power is making the dominant power fearful, and it led to a war. Now, this has then been applied on a grander scale and to the modern times and is now known colloquially as Thucydides Trap. It's the idea, again, that a rising power, if there's a dominant power with a rising power on the way, what will result is a war. And so we're going to look into that as some historical examples and maybe apply it to some of the geopolitical events going on today. But so Alex, Thucydides Trap. After practicing it for a couple times before recording, what do you think of this geopolitical theory? Is it a valid one to look back at?
Well, first off, I basically had to write this name down in code on this piece of paper next to me just so I could say it correctly. So hopefully it's right. Watch, we're still butchering it. There's going to be a Greek listener who's going to be like, "Hey, no, it's not correct." But I think first we have to remember that Greek history, or ancient Greece, and all these writings are all just written down, usually by Romans, ancient Romans. So we have to take all of it with a grain of salt, right? A lot of it is a lot of analogies, a lot of metaphors, and a lot of mixing of myth and history. Mm-hmm. But it's a fascinating story about how a rising power threatens a hegemon, or a local power, I guess, in this case. And basically what happened here was, as the clout of Athens grew, they became more respectful. They became more conscious of past injustices, and they became more risk takers. And I think it's interesting to see, because throughout history, and I'm talking about ancient history, modern history, and potentially the future, this seems to be a common trend. And there's a great study, actually. So the University of Harvard, or Harvard University, I said that, has actually been investing in this theory, and they actually have a project where they've been studying since 2016, I believe, this project. And just in the the first case they look at is from the 15th century, and they go all the way up until the end of the 20th century. And Harvard has identified 16 different cases that may demonstrate this trap. And so really fast, bear with me, I'm just going to say all of them just so people know, because we're going to have a graph on the screen on YouTube, and I just want to say them out just to make it clear, because it is interesting. So the first one, you had Portugal versus Spain in the late 15th century. You had then France versus the Habsburgs. Then you had the Habsburgs versus the Ottoman Empire. Then you had the Habsburgs versus Sweden. Then you had the Dutch Republic versus England. Then you had France versus Great Britain. Then you had the United Kingdom versus Russia. Then you had France versus Germany. Then you had China and Russia versus Japan. Then you had the U.S. versus the United States, which did not end in war, by the way. And then you had the United Kingdom versus Russia. Then you had the Soviet Union, France, United Kingdom versus Germany, which was War II. And then you had the United States versus Japan. And then you had the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, which was the Cold War. And then in the current 90s, you had the UK and France versus Germany, which was no war. So what I'm trying to highlight is there are a lot of changes in global dynamics. And the first one, which was Spain and Portugal, did not end in war, nor did the early issue versus the U.S. and the United Kingdom, or the Cold War, obviously. But 12 out of 16 of these cases ended in war, and that's 75%, and it's quite interesting. And I think it does show us that in one way or another, changes in global power dynamics are almost a tipping point and can lead to war. Now, I'm not saying that it's just because there's two powers there's going to be war, but it can be likely.
Right. First off the bat, you look at this list that Harvard has produced about where the trap could apply, Thucydides Trap. And yeah, I mean, you look at the ones that, I mean, you have some major things. I mean, World War II is one of the big ones there. And these are not just examples of wars. Again, these are examples of where the balance of power. We have a rising global power going against a dominant global power. And even some of these are kind of arguable, right? Like the one about the United States and the Soviet Union, how that was the Thucydides Trap that did not result in a war. It did not result in a direct war, but it certainly resulted in a ton of periphery wars. I mean, the Cold War was anything but cold to the people that died because of it, right? I'm referencing Korea. I'm referencing Vietnam. The idea of, do anything at all costs to stop the expanse of communism, right? The expanse of communism is basically saying the expanse of the Soviet Union and their political influence in the form of communism. So yeah, I mean, even the ones here that are like, well, there wasn't a war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union directly. I would even still argue, yeah, but there was a lot of global unrest because of this Thucydides Trap. The United States and the Soviet Union actually as the rising power, eventually failing, of course, but it does seem like there's definitely a pattern, and it's more common that the result of this Thucydides Trap is conflict. And the guy in charge of that Harvard study is actually a political scientist known as Graham T. Allison. This is the guy that coined the term Thucydides Trap. Now, obviously, Thucydides came up with the theory and the idea of it, but it wasn't coined the term as the trap, Thucydides Trap, until Graham Allison gave it that name recently. And so he's still alive. And I watched his TED Talks about the Thucydides Trap and how he applies it to China and the U.S. today. Very interesting stuff. But he also made one point about the trap that I thought was really interesting, which was the idea that, yes, we think it's pretty much inevitable that there will be conflict when you have a rising power and a dominant power, but it's not always because of the provocation of one of those powers. He says that oftentimes both of these parties don't want to go to war. The great example is the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, they're both rational actors to a point, and they both understood, man, if we go to a head-to-head war, that would be catastrophic, right? Millions and millions and millions of people would have died. And so Allison says that this is often the case in any time we have the trap, but many times it's a third-party provocation that leads it to the trap, right? He gives the example of World War I, right? So in World War I, the rising power and the dominant power was the United Kingdom and Germany, right? Empires. The 18th century had just ended, the 19th century just ended. We're just now into the 20th. With technology, people are trying to expand their empires. But what really started World War I was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Serbia, an Austrian-Hungarian guy in Serbia. They had nothing to do with the two dominant powers, but it was this third-party provocation that spread like a wildfire to then, very quickly all of Europe was in a war. So I thought that was a really interesting point.
Yes, completely. And that was something I'd written down too. I did not see the TED Talk, unfortunately. I saw you put it in, but I did not get to it. But that was something that was also in the Atlantic, and you have two powers that are potentially battling for control, or not control, but dominance in the world. And in this case, a standard crisis, like potentially the assassination of the Archduke, will basically just cause a cascading of effects. And I think that is a really interesting point. And I decided, because I was interested by this, because one article talked about the Rome-Parthian Wars as another trap. And so I actually went back and looked at 53 BC. And it's actually really fascinating because it sounded like a very similar crisis to what you talked about and what Allison talked about in his TED Talk, was that you basically had a dominant Rome that was already starting to see internal issues. This was about the period where their democracy was turning more into a dictatorship. Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, you had what was it? You had this Seleucid Empire, which was already crumbling as well. And Parthia, which was a part of this empire, basically had a nomadic insurgents that broke away from the Seleucid Empire and decided to put up a border on Rome's eastern side. And through a few small battles and this collapsing Seleucid Empire, you saw a very costly war for Rome that basically destabilized Rome and ended in a stalemate. And after this time, you basically had two powers on each other's side who it was a lot like the Cold War, I think, where it just got extremely pricey and there was no good outcome, but it also caused somewhat of a collapse inside of Rome. And and what I got out of this with what we've seen also, I think, with World War One, was that you had this is a theory I have, but I think sometimes this trap occurs when the hegemony is starting to crumble.
Right.
And we saw this happening with the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire during World War One, and I think it was very similar to the Roman Empire during this period. And it seems to be almost a necessary factor to this trap to happen, is that the power needs to have internal strife in order for another power to almost take over. And now that's worrying to me because, a lot of historians and political scientists always kind of compare the United States to ancient Rome in some aspects during the twilight of Rome, and the fact that we have a lot of costly wars overseas, we have a lot of division at home, and our question, and we're starting to become challenged on the world stage. And so to me, if I had to think of the trap, you would have to think of those factors coming into it.
Right. You're just saying like the dominant power is almost a little bit waning, and that allows for the trap to be more dangerous.
Yes.
Yeah, I definitely see that today. I mean, I think that's a very good point. Like, I think I definitely see that today, right? I think the United States has been a hegemony since the end of World War II. You can even argue before that, some historians would argue since the end of World War One, the United States was the dominant power on the globe. Certainly since World War II with the, atomic bomb and all that. The United States has been the top dog for, close to 100 years. But I would argue that dominance and that hegemony is waning, right? It's not gone, but it's not going up. It's going down, and it's being challenged by China, right? So that's kind of the trap we're facing today. I would argue is the United States versus China, and yeah, what you just mentioned is it's we have a country that's pretty politically divided, goes back and forth, right, with their political leanings, right, from Obama to Trump is a pretty drastic change, whereas China is kind of a one-party, here you get what you get system. So yeah, I do see like the trap. I do see the Thucydides trap appearing today, and certainly so does Graham Allison, and he talks about how he's optimistic that more people have the understanding of Thucydides trap, and understand that what the global dynamics are, and are more willing to try and avoid it. But again, he also mentions, the formula is there, right? You have a rising power, and not just any rising power. We're talking about, China. He gives an example of this. In 1978, 90% of China was below the extreme poverty line, which is living on less than $2 a day. 90% of the country was below that. Now in 2014, right, fast forward 35 years, 1% of China is below that extreme poverty line, right? So you have a massive shift to now China has the largest middle class in the world with the largest economy. And what he says is, Graham Allison says, China has the most ambitious and in his view, most competent leader on the world stage. And that's President Xi Jinping. And it's no secret what he wants. Now, he's not saying competent as like a compliment. I think he's saying competent as Xi Jinping's a smart cookie. He's not a dummy. He knows how to get what he wants. And what he wants is, he's laid out by 2049, they want China to be the global dominant power. We've talked about the Belt and Road on the other podcasts, all this. China is very obviously gunning for the top seat. And so this is now the trap that we're seeing, right? The United States has been in the top seat and is worried about the change in the status quo. Trump, this is no secret either, right? Trump with the whole trade war. He's obviously been critical of China's and their trade practices and their economic power. And so, the trap is there. The trap is there. And I think that perhaps the third party provocateur that could become a problem is North Korea, is Kim Jong-un.
That's a very interesting. It's a really interesting take. I didn't really think about that, but I think there are some takeaways there. And yeah, I mean, I want to get to that, but first I wanted to say you're correct that it in some ways is inevitable that China, I mean, I'm not going to say it's definite they're going to overtake the U.S., but could we be in another bipolar world? I don't know, but it's true that according to the Peloponnesian War, the Atlantic says that it was also natural that Sparta interpreted the Athenian posture as unreasonable, ungrateful, and threatening to the system it had established. Mm-hmm. And that sounds very similar to what the U.S. is saying now, right? China is questioning a status quo that clearly has benefited most of the world, but obviously has benefited the U.S. more than anyone else.
Right.
And it's actually interesting because America was in a similar place in the early 1900s and 1800s and the late 1800s when it was acting very similar to China now. You know, we were kind of stepping out and rebelling against the world order with Panama, you know, the Monroe Doctrine,
right.
Our blockade of stopping a blockade of German ships in Venezuela. And so we have also been in the periphery and fought for it. And the similarities are key. I mean, China's basically doing what we did 100 years ago. And I think you're right that there's going to need to be a third party because China is a 5,000-year-old civilization with 1.3 billion people or something, and it's very clear that China is going to be coming out of it, and North Korea is interesting. I think that's an interesting take. I also think that Europe is going to be key. Russia is going to be key.
Yes.
Because Iran is also going to be key. I think these are these periphery states that have kind of been outcasts from the United States order. And so Europe obviously doesn't fall into that. But I think Russia, Iran, and China. And the problem there is that those are both not, giant economic powers that have a giant political force. But they sometimes can act out of character and can sometimes incite violence. And that's my fear, is that even some of the best leadership in the U.S. would almost be forced to retaliate, and obviously Trump would definitely retaliate. Right. And so that is really worrying, And but the one thing, I think the elephant in the room is that the 20th century. So it's interesting. 12 out of 16 in all those Harvard cases, right, have ended in war. But in the 20th century, only 50% of them have ended in war. Mm-hmm. And I would argue it's mainly because of the fact of interdependence and globalization has made it harder to go to war. And just the creation of the nuclear bomb made war almost destruction. Yeah. Yes, it made it almost impossible. I mean, it's really unlikely that either side wants to go out and intentionally blow the other one up, because ironically, both sides can't win, but both sides could lose.
Yeah, there's a lot of game theory when you start getting into the details of these traps, right? So that's a really good point. You mentioned how the trap over all of history, or the case is given by Harvard, it's a majority of the time it does lead to war. But very good point. I didn't even think of that it's only 50% when you hit into the 20th century. Definitely because, I would argue, because of mutually assured destruction, right? Russia and the United States are both, at the time during the Cold War, rational actors that understood that firing the nukes, you would not be able to dismantle their inventory of nukes before they kill you, so everyone dies. Yeah, you just don't want to go down that route. Connecting it today, I wonder if that's similar as far as economic interdependence, right? Yeah, maybe it's less so than nukes. I'm not really too worried about China and the United States putting nukes at each other. I mean, both have nuclear capabilities. I think mutually assured destruction still applies. I also think now it's mutually assured economic destruction, right? Instead of MAD, it's MAED, because the U.S. and China are so economically tied now. So much business is going back and forth. Now, a little bit less so, right, with the change in the trade laws and with the coronavirus pandemic, people are changing trade routes, but that still we still can't ignore the billions and billions of dollars in economic interdependence we have with China. That was not there with the USSR. We weren't doing business with the USSR during that whole debacle. So it is a different thing, and I think the economic interdependence might almost be a new version of mutually assured destruction. But you're certainly right that also, there are these third-party actors that are perhaps less rational than a Xi Jinping. You give a great example is Iran. Iran has nuclear capabilities and says some pretty crazy stuff. Vladimir Putin in Russia. Vladimir Putin in Russia, I think, is definitely a threat to the United States, but he's nothing on the terms of the global hegemonic scale of like a China. but he certainly could be that third-party provocation that leads both into war. Because again, the whole point about this trap is it's a trap. You don't want to go into a trap. And Graham Allison mentions that again, like oftentimes both of these powers don't want a war. They understand that a war would be catastrophic, but they're led into it because of the change in the status quo and the power dynamic, and often because of someone else that's leading them down that route. So yeah, I could see a Vladimir Putin doing things that would piss off both the United States and China. I could see Kim Jong-un doing things that piss off both the United States and China and dragging us into something that we don't want to be a part of. And it, it depends on how rational those actors are. Putin maybe more so than Kim Jong-un as far as a rational man, evil and diabolical, but rational. So yeah, it's definitely scary that some of the elements of the trap are there, but it's also reassuring that perhaps something like mutually assured destruction or mutually assured economic destruction might prevent a full-blown war from happening between the United States and China, because again, no one in the world wants a full-blown war between the U.S. and China. That would be into the perhaps billions of deaths.
Right, completely. And another third party, which is not potentially a country, I think, is the coronavirus, because it's politicized finger pointing, and we have seen the EU is now calling for accountability from China. Australia is now calling for an investigation, and obviously, clearly, Trump is definitely pointing fingers at China.
Yeah,
and the problem is that there's all this misinformation going around, but there are some people that think that there is potential that there was negligence in a coronavirus lab in Wuhan, which obviously I've heard that that's total BS, and I've also heard that that potentially could have happened. And the problem is that all this misinformation in itself could be the third party that causes this to happen. And that scares me more. That scares me more because, but the other problem I have too, which is kind of the more pessimistic part of me, is that earlier leaders during the Cold War and World War II had kind of set up an apparatus that would stop a war from breaking out. JFK talked about the precarious rules of the status quo, where basically Russia and the United States had rules, arms limits, control treaties, and rules for road, sea, and air. And these kind of kept each other in their own spheres, kept each other out of potential violence. Also, the problem is Obama, Clinton, they kind of just were idealistic about China, always talking about how they don't need someone like George Kennan, who was involved in his long telegram warned of the Cold War, or Paul Nietzsche's NSC 68, which National Security Council 68, which both were basically high level plans on how to deal with the Soviet Union. The problem is, from Clinton, Obama, Bush, back into the 90s, we haven't actually had a concrete plan on dealing with China. And so we've kind of looked at them as just this abstract threat that is growing. And the problem is that we're actually not prepared on how to deal with China. And I'm worried that, we have giant ships out in the South Pacific. What if one of those runs into a Chinese ship? What if we fire on one another? There's no rules. It's the Wild West out there. And I think that's the biggest thing we could take away from this, is you can prevent a trap in certain ways if you prepare for a trap.
Right. That's a really good. That's a very, 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 very good point. That I don't think we've prepared really for China. And again, China's expanded so rapidly that, someone in the 1990s could have been like, yeah, okay, they got some factories, but come on, there's still 1 billion people in poverty. And then boom, 15 years goes by, and now everyone in China has an iPhone. And it's like, whoa, they expanded so rapidly that it's almost hard to prepare. But you're absolutely right that you're definitely right that administrations have dropped the ball. And again, that it might also be kind of a result of the nature of our system, is we change administrations every 4 to 8 years. You know what I mean? Completely. And all the foreign policy, even the people involved in the bureaucracies get kind of cleaned out. Whereas in China, Xi Jinping is going to be the guy, especially now that he's, become basically leader for life. He's in charge for a while, and whereas we're going to have a new administration maybe in a couple months. And if not then in 4 years we'll have a new president. And so we almost constantly change, whereas China stays the same as far as who's leading, and maybe that is hindering our ability to prepare for the hegemonic change.
Yes, definitely. And it's true. I think someone like Xi Jinping is not thinking about the short term, like you said. You
No.
can prepare for something like this, and the problem is this is. I mean, I don't like this, but kind of the paradox of this is that you can't really choose war, but one leader can stop it.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost think that Xi Jinping would be the one who would not want to go to war more than the political, waves that go through a democracy. Because I think there's more to risk in the Chinese mind because, like you said, by 2049, they want to be a world leader. They have the long term. But someone like Trump, as we talked about in our podcast earlier this week, he thinks in the short term.
Right.
So it's a little bit worrying, and I think that's exactly what this trap illustrates: is this whole dynamic, and then the criticisms I've heard people say about this trap is that people say it's inevitable. War isn't inevitable. No, you're right, but it's just these trickling effects. It's these tipping points that eventually break. It was the assassination of the Archduke.
Mm-hmm.
It was when the Parthians finally had a border with Rome. There's these small things that happen and eventually lead to this. It was when Athens started finally infringing on Sparta.
Right. It could be now today, right? It could be a North Korea, or it could be a Hong Kong protest that starts spreading to more Chinese-ish areas, right? Like Taiwan or something, or Taipei. Yeah, you could definitely see something so small forcing people's hands into something they don't want to be a part of, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons the United States has been so, like half supporting the Hong Kong protesters. We're like, yeah, good luck, guys, but like that's kind of it. Is because of this trap that we don't get ourselves involved in. Something this small could lead to something bigger. And there's a lot of fear. And again, I also think this change in the global dynamic, it could be really dangerous for Americans just because of our American culture. Is we're kind of, now that it's been 100 years, we're kind of accustomed to being top dog. I mean, growing up, being educated in the American public and private education systems, I learned that America's the top dog. We're the quote unquote the good guys in the story of the world. And there was no reason to think otherwise. Well, now there's a lot of reason to think otherwise, and I think it might be challenging for Americans to live with the idea of China being dominant over the United States. I don't think that's going to sit well with a lot of people, and I think that it may lead to some resentment that could and lead down the trap. Right? It's going to be a hard thing to swallow for Americans to be like, wow, we're not the global dominant power, and the global dominant power is a country that's not democratic. It might cause some conflict. And to be fair, I think so too. I'm not exactly comfortable with the idea of a Xi Jinping China being the global dominant power that disregards human rights and disregards free speech. It is scary. So, the tides are certainly shifting and changing. And this trap is definitely worrisome. And then, I do think that Graham Allison ended his TED Talk with a point about the trap. Is, look, like, we know it's there. People need to study it. Those that don't study history are doomed to repeat it. So it's important that our leaders are looking into this dynamic theory so that they can avoid being dragged into the trap themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And if you study history, I mean, just like we've talked about, looking through these are only 16 cases since the 15th century, pretty much since globalization occurred, which, and it illustrates a trend, right? And trends aren't always correct. Mm-hmm. And obviously the 20th century trend was 50-50. And who knows what the 21st century trend will be.
Sure.
But, since the Cold War, we've kind of gone into a century of hot peace so far, mm-hmm. right? And that's kind of what I would assume would happen. I just couldn't see the U.S. and China ever actually, blowing each other up, for example. But I could definitely see small skirmishes, economic wars, and sometimes when everyone's starving and can't get supplies, and maybe you fall into a depression or a recession, that's sometimes worse than a hot war.
Yeah. Cyber wars too, maybe cyber wars. Certainly.
Biowars.
Biowars, right. I mean, That's a lot of good points. I mean, I think I'm with you too. Like, I do think it's probably unlikely again because of like a face-to-face ground war. Because again, China's not stupid. The United States is not stupid. We know that if we had if we had like a D-Day invasion on the coast of China, oh my God, I mean, it'd be ridiculous. So many people would die for no reason. I don't think anyone wants that. But the whole idea of the trap is you can find yourselves in a position where you didn't even want to be because of just the global dynamics. And I could see that definitely playing out into like economic wars for sure. Definitely periphery wars, like, the hot peace you just mentioned. That was the Cold War, right? It was, it wasn't cold in Vietnam.
No.
So yeah, that could definitely be the case. Hopefully maybe this is the century to, break past that 50-50 barrier and say, no, we're not going to fall into this trap. We understand that global dynamics are changing, but perhaps we can combat this peacefully, or through other means than a war. But it's certainly an interesting theory, certainly a lot to chew on, and I also think it really highlights the absolute need for our modern leaders to understand and look at history in depth, like really have an understanding of history, because like the old saying is, history is doomed to repeat itself.
Yeah. Yeah, completely. And I mean, this is just the thought to kind of leave people with, is that I think something that we could come together on if we were smart as the two, I guess, kind of dual hegemons, if you want to call them that, 5G. I think that's something we could come together on instead of be divided on. The Soviets and the Russians had a race to the moon, right? And it kind of divided us even more. But I think something like 5G, how instrumental it is. I mean, flying to the moon only impacts, the higher ups and the advancement of the U.S. or Russia, right? Like it's kind of a vision of the future. But 5G could change everyone's lives. And I think in a weird way, if we could somehow come together on that, that could be interesting.
Yeah, kind of like the Belt and Road. It could be, I mean, it could be kind of the thing where the United States and China compete to be the best provider of, goods and services to the world, right? Who's the better good guy? That'd be a great competition. I would love for the two hegemonies to compete at increasing the standard of living around the world. Who's better at bringing people out of poverty? That'd be great. But we'll see if that happens. Or it might happen with dual motives too. All right. Well, with that, that'll end this episode of the Tonic Accord. A little bit about geopolitics. Let us know what you think. Are we about to get trapped like a bear in Thucydides Trap? Or do you think that we have the wherewithal and the know-how to avoid the trap and perhaps seek a different future? Let us know your thoughts, and thank you again for listening. Anything from you, Alex, before we head out?
No, I'm just like always, it's great to talk with you. Keep safe. Just keep optimistic. It does look like, I mean, at least on paper, it looks like things are starting to get at least a little bit less hectic. So we'll keep you guys in tune, and thanks everyone for listening.
Take care.